WVVA in Focus, a weekly program about important issues and events in the two Virginias.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this edition of In Focus. I'm your host, Melinda Zosh. This morning, we're talking about a very important topic. Is America in danger of losing its soul? In fact, this was an op-ed published earlier this month in the Courier-Journal that covers news in Louisville, Kentucky, and southern Indiana. And again, the title is America in danger of losing its soul? The conversation everyone needs to have in 2021. It's written by Dr. Louis Brogdon, who's going to join us here in just a moment. He's a Bluefield native and director of Institute for Black Church Studies and a religion professor at Baptist Seminary of Kentucky and also at Bluefield College. Also joining us today to share some insight on this, again, very important topic about troubles in America. We have several pastors. Brandon Hay, who's with Life Church in Claypool Hill, Virginia, and also Pastor Travis Lowe joining us this morning with the Crossroads Church in Bluefield, West Virginia. So, Dr. Brogdon, we'll start with you this morning. Your op-ed alludes to President Biden mentioning that he was fighting for the soul of America, and we heard that quite a bit during his campaign. You touch on various issues plaguing this country in your op-ed, from economic disparities to racial injustices and more. But can you elaborate more on the issues that are impacting America right now?
Well, I wrote the article because, you know, what the president was trying to do was to do more than politics as usual, which is, you know, just worry about getting elected. I think he recognized that there are more things going on in this particular moment that we are in, and he is trying to provide moral leadership. So what the piece does is it picks up and basically says that the soul of America is in trouble, and the fight is not over because of the election. There are a lot of things going on in this country that are very, very troubling. Mm-hmm. We are polarized and divided. There's discord and violence on every hand. We are literally at each other's throats. And I just felt that, you know, God wanted me to, in the sort of spirit of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., mm-hmm. to begin a national conversation about how we can be a better country. Because Jesus wisely said, a house that's divided against itself, mm-hmm. it cannot stand. And so I think it's up to all of us to sort of stop, to sort of take a deep breath, and to get our fingers out of everyone else's face, mm-hmm. and begin to just say, wait a minute, what can I do to help America to be a better country? And so I'm excited that I've had the wonderful opportunity to write the op-ed in response to a call that the president has issued, but to then really pick that up as both a minister and a religious scholar, and to launch a broader, more comprehensive conversation about our national character, which is something I talk about in the piece.
Right, because it's an important topic, not just during President Biden, then candidate Biden's campaign, but to keep that conversation going.
Absolutely.
And Pastor Hay, what issues do you feel are most impacting the U.S. right now?
Well, something I like, Dr. Brogdon, that you said in the article is you kind of cut through a lot of the specifics and said hate is a major problem. Mm-hmm. And othering is something else that you talked about. And when I think of othering, I tend to go to like a sports analogy of, I know what it's like to be a fan of a team, two rival teams, and if you're on one team, and you're pulling for one team, everything the other team does is bad. If anything good happens for the other team, mm-hmm. well, that's not fair. Yeah. Yeah. They cheated. Or if the other team does something bad or wrong, it's not just wrong, but it's evil. It's like that's who that person is. And I see us doing that in America. I even see it sometimes kind of going over into the church where it's like you're on one team mm-hmm. or the other team. And it makes it easier to hate the other team mm-hmm. because you think they're evil and we're good. Mm-hmm. And I just see that happening in so many different areas of like this grouping of people together, and it just leads to hate.
Right, like an us versus them mentality. And
yeah.
really it comes down to knowing your neighbors and knowing those who are different than yourself, yeah. interest-wise or otherwise. And Pastor Lowe, what about you? What would you add to what Pastor Hay and what Dr. Brogdon have said about the issues plaguing America? And also, it seems like there's so many issues. How do we overcome them as a society?
Right, and I believe what everybody's saying is we sense this. People from every political background, this cuts across parties, it cuts across so many of the divisions. We sense that there's something that just doesn't feel quite right. Like we're not living our best. My church is participating in a prayer service, and they're having the prayer service in the middle of the country, and they're saying, praying for the heart of America in the heart of America. And it falls right in line with what Dr. Brogdon is saying, that we sense that there's something more we could be doing. There's something better that we could be, a better life that we could be living. And a whole lot of that is how do we cut past the hate? He goes into how do we learn how to forgive? If we're going to address any of these major issues, we've got to learn to forgive, and we've got to learn to listen.
And I think that's key to forgiveness, but it seems like it would be one person at a time that you have to find it in your heart to forgive. But Dr. Brogdon, what do you think? Why is forgiveness so important for us to move past some of the troubles just haunting this country right now?
Well, I mean, forgiveness is talked about in Scripture. So part of the irony of this moment that we're in is that America calls itself a Christian nation. And so much of this hate and this violence is happening under the auspices of churches. I mean, churches are either participating in it, they're silent about it, which is only encouraging it to continue. I'm deeply troubled, I'm mortified that more Christian leaders aren't standing up and saying, wait a minute, this is not right. Because once we're able to acknowledge that the hate is there, then as a nation influenced by the Christian tradition, what are we supposed to do? Well, forgiveness is one of those wonderful practices that helps us to move beyond that. At the end of the op-ed, I also talk about the work of Dr. King, who in one sermon on a passage on Matthew chapter 5 talked about how do you forgive, how do you love your enemies? And one of the things he said is you can't, no matter if you think a person is your enemy, the thing you disagree with them about never expresses the whole of who they are. And that could really help this country right now. Is yes, we're going to have our differences, and I think ideological differences is healthy for a democracy. But the threat of hate we have to confront, and we're going to need tools like forgiveness, love, and not thinking the worst about each other because we disagree about certain things. And it's going to take religious leaders to exercise moral leadership in this country and start teaching people how to be neighbors with each other.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that because I do want to get into that more with the pastors and as we go on with the segment. So we do have to take a quick break. Stay with us. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back to this edition of In Focus. This morning we are tackling a very important topic. We're looking at this op-ed in depth, Is America in Danger of Losing Its Soul, written by Dr. Lewis Brogdon, a Bluefield native and professor, scholar. So Dr. Brogdon and our local pastors, I want to thank you all for joining us and just taking the time out of your schedules to talk about this important subject. And Dr. Brogdon, I'll start with you. Again, you recently wrote this op-ed. You also say that there's a quote, that stubborn refusal to right the wrongs of the past and present around issues of race, political dysfunction in Washington that is more beholden to corporate interests than the people, and a hyper-partisan, tribalistic two-party system that is tearing the country apart. That's mentioned here in your article. Why do you think there is a refusal? Who is refusing to right these wrongs? Can you just elaborate more on this and some of the corporate interests and two-party system that you alluded to in your op-ed?
Yeah, I think, it's a sophisticated way to really basically talk about how we're not good neighbors to each other. And if we start seeing each other as neighbors, I think there will be more of a willingness to do something that Pastor Lowe mentioned, is do some listening. We're in this sort of historical moment where everybody is so focused on sort of their own way. And Proverbs 14:12 says, there's a way that seems right unto a man, but in the end thereof are the ways of death. And we're just kind of in that moment where if we keep trying to do things our way, we're going to destroy this country. And we're already doing it. It's happening right before our eyes. So we know we have a history of enslaving people. We know we have a history of genocide as it relates to African Americans. Women didn't get the right to vote until, after the Civil War. So we have these things in our history, and there's no need to pretend that they don't happen, which, again, this is why I'm so surprised more Christian leaders aren't standing up in this moment, because something that we do every week is own our sinfulness. I mean, that's a Christian practice, and people are acting like, as a country, we can't do that. We have to pretend that we don't have these painful things, and that these painful things have not affected groups of people who are our neighbors. And so no one is saying that you're supposed to hate the country. We're saying you have to be honest about what has happened, and how do we work together to build something different. That's really all it comes down to it, but there are people who absolutely refuse to do that. What has happened with our two-party system is very, very dysfunctional. It's almost become very, very tribalistic, and so you ought to see some of the data and the research in social psychology on that. And so I'm just trying to, again, encourage us. How do we find a way to inspire the best of us so that we can build a better country where we can all live in peace and thrive together?
And Pastor Hay, what are your thoughts on what Dr. Brogdon just said? And it seems like he's almost asking for like a call for action. Church leaders, it just seems like they're, not all, but some are just standing by and watching this play out without really taking action and steps and talking to their congregations about what's going on. What are your thoughts on that and the role that faith leaders should be playing right now?
Well, you said something real important. You said it's a call to action. And Dr. Brogdon, you just started out by saying we're not always good neighbors to each other. And it reminds me of Jesus saying the greatest two commands are love God and love your neighbor. But then the response was, well, who's my neighbor?
Right.
Almost like sometimes we try to find a loophole. Well, who's that? And do I love them?
Yeah.
You know, depending on who my neighbor is.
Right.
And that kind of goes back to the other or the two tribes. But Jesus' answered in response was a story of action. And there was a man that came into town. He was robbed and beaten up, and he was laying in the street suffering, and three people passed by, a priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan. And the first one that passed by, the priest, it's like he doesn't see the suffering. Maybe he's too busy. The Levite passes by, and it says he sees it, but he keeps going. And that makes me think that maybe the cost was too high. But the Samaritan stops, and he puts the person that's suffering, he puts his need ahead of his own. And one of the things that you ask too is who is the ones that's refusing to acknowledge the issues that we've had in America. And you mentioned a lot of the history and the different things that have happened, and who is refusing to act. And when I think of that story of the Good Samaritan, there were two that didn't act, and I got to say, the person refusing, sometimes it's been me. And I haven't always acted with the kind of love that I should have as a pastor. And I've got to first look at that and prayerfully be more like the Good Samaritan and respond and put others' needs before my own and not be too busy to see what's really happening.
That takes so much courage. Thank you for saying that. That's very, very powerful. If that happens across this country, that's going to be a very, very important step in this journey to what I hope will be a movement.
Right, because it really could start one person at a time, or it seems like it does, but you have to be self-aware and recognize your shortcomings and say, you know what, maybe I haven't always loved my neighbor, or I've been selective of loving someone that just has more similar interests than me. So I think it comes down to being self-aware. Pastor Lowe, what are your thoughts on what Pastor Hay and Dr. Brogdon just said?
Well, I think it's really neat. Dr. Brogdon said it's something that we do every week, acknowledging our shortcomings. And as Christians, it is something that we should be able to lead on. A large part of our theology is that we've all messed up. Yeah. We've all fallen short. We've all missed the mark. And that's something that we confess. But I think that it seems like in our society today we've become so attached to being right that we don't want to let go of anything because I want to be right. Yeah. And as Christians, I think we should be able to find that place to where we say, you know what, I may be wrong. I may not have this all figured out. Maybe I should listen, maybe because I've missed the mark before.
Yes.
I've fallen short before, so take it as an opportunity to hear what others are saying.
And it just seems like we are living in a society full of fear right now too, right? With the shootings we hear about, we're talking about it on the news almost every day, you know. In Colorado, back in March, people walking into a grocery store at King Soopers were killed just shopping for groceries. And it seems like that could also fuel the fire with the pandemic too, you know, with people just being fearful and the unknowns. How do you as pastors, let me ask you this, Pastor, hey, how do you overcome that with your congregation to work through some of the fears and anxieties that we're just facing as a society? Because I do feel like that fuels a lot of like the hatred and a lot going on that's negative right now.
I think one of the big things is when it comes to just being afraid is the thought that I'm going to be vulnerable. Mm-hmm. So kind of going back to the discussion we're having about a call to action, mm-hmm. I think sometimes there is a fear to act because we're afraid of the vulnerabilities that come along with it, like the dangers of violence. Mm-hmm. But the truth is you can't do anything meaningful without risk. Mm-hmm. So what I would say to our congregation is without vulnerability, you really can't do anything. And yes, there is that fear, but if I'm going to do something meaningful and really flourish in life, I've got to be willing to, you know, take risks and face those fears. It doesn't mean that I'm never afraid. Mm-hmm. It just means that, you know, I go into it, maybe that fear is there, but the meaning of what we're trying to do is more important than the fear or even the risk. Mm-hmm. The risk is worth it, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm. And just kind of adjusting your mindset. We do have to take a quick break in one moment, but I want to give Pastor Lowe a chance to respond to that as well. How do we overcome as a society, person by person, just like the fears that people are dealing with and how that just kind of fuels the fire, it seems like right now?
Yeah, I think that's such a hard question to answer, and I think that Dr. Brogdon does a good job in the article of pulling us deeper than just the surface level issues, the things that we're seeing. And when he pulls us to the place to where we recognize the hate, then we recognize that as being wrong. Mm-hmm. And then he calls us to that deeper walk of forgiveness and listening. And I think it's much easier to take courageous steps when we really believe in what we're doing. So it's a call to virtue, to being a virtuous nation, to being virtuous people. And when we feel like we have that kind of a call on ourselves, then we're more likely to step into the things that we may would have avoided before.
Important topic. Well, we have to take one more quick break. We have much more to talk about. We'll be right back after this. Good morning. Welcome back to this edition of In Focus. What you're seeing on your screen right now, it's an op-ed recently published, written by Dr. Louis Brogdon, published in the Louisville Courier-Journal earlier this month, tackling a very important topic. And also, you can go to that website you see on your screen to see the entire article, read it in depth. There's questions there that we'll get to that in just a bit. But I'd like to welcome back our guests. And Dr. Brogdon, I'll start with you. You've been mentioning this throughout the segment, but how can those in faith leadership roles help educate and also work toward a solution in the problems we've been discussing today?
Well, you know, this is why I like the language of call that I use toward the end, because it's the kind of language that pastors and religious leaders are familiar with. There is a deeper reason why we do what we do. We definitely don't do it for the money, because the money is not very good.
Right.
We do it because we believe in a higher cause, a higher call, something that God wants us to do. And we are in a unique historical moment, and we need leaders to lead. And we need leaders to start encouraging more good, because there are a bunch of leaders who are encouraging the worst. And they have big platforms, they have large followings, and they are inspiring discord, vitriol, violence, animosity, indifference, insensitivity, things that are literally destroying this country. And if good people sit on the sidelines and say, I don't want to get involved in politics, I think the church should just be quiet, then we're going to give this country away. We have to stand up and to say, we can be better. And people who believe in goodness, we need to start encouraging that in the public square. And so, I wrote it for that very reason, to encourage leaders to lead, to stand up in this moment. And I love the subtitle to the op-ed. It's the conversation every American needs to have. Every American needs to have a conversation about, are you going to be on the side of those encouraging the worst, or are you going to be on the side of those who are, in spite of our differences, encouraging the best in each other so that we can build a better nation?
Right, because one day history will look back on this moment, and it's up to us as people, as a society, to decide how that history book is written.
Yes.
And Pastor Hay, what are your thoughts on what Dr. Brogdon just said? And just really, we've been talking about this call to action and just faith leaders stepping up and good people stepping up and saying it's time for a change.
I would definitely agree that a lot of times the church leaders haven't been speaking up like they should. But I've also, along with that, I want to just kind of point out that I'm encouraged by you speaking up, Dr. Brogdon and Pastor Travis, my good friend here with me. And as friends, I see like pastors that are speaking up, and that encourages me to see other people speaking up. And historically, I think that leaders in the church have been ones that have spoken up at times, not always, but people like William Seymour in the early 1900s. It ended up in a move of God that led to racial walls being broken down. You hope that would continue forward, and maybe on a grander scale now that we could see something like that. Or the Memphis Miracle with Bernard Underwood that Pastor Travis had wrote an article on, kind of speaks to the same thing, but it started with leaders doing what you're saying, being courageous enough, bold enough to do something. I think it starts, like when I'm thinking about just looking in the mirror, with saying, "Search me, O God," it says in Psalm 139. Are there any wicked ways in me, any blind spots that I'm missing first? And then from there, just at some point, we're going to have to start fellowshipping with people that we think are on the other team, or that disagree with us, or someone that we see as other. Like, how can we break down those walls and those barriers to where we can really do life together?
And Pastor Lowe, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's the essence of what we have to shoot for as faith leaders. We need to be witnesses to the world of what this looks like, be witnesses to neighboring each other. We're sitting here today, and we don't agree on every issue. We don't always see everything the same. There's probably lots of things that we see different, but hopefully what you're seeing through this conversation is people that disagree that can sit and have a conversation and engage civilly and carry that forward. The idea of witnessing in Christianity isn't just telling somebody something, but it was being a witness. If you were a witness to the fact that God can change lives, the way that you're a witness is your changed life. That's the witness. If you're a witness to healing, it's by that you're healed, that you're walking in healing. So for us to be witnesses of neighborliness or of reconciliation, it's for us to embody that. And I think that's what we're trying to do here. Taking a step in that direction, and disagreements are okay, but how do we reach across and love each other?
Right, and just having respect for your neighbor too,
Right.
Not raising your voice, like listening from a point of understanding rather than making a judgment. I think that can go a long way too. Before we go, I do want to mention, Dr. Brogdon, that viewers can actually go online. We have a website for them. They can go online. There it is, and tell us more about how the questions online, once they go to that website, how they can use those questions maybe in small groups or otherwise.
Okay. Yeah, I'm very excited about this, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
You're welcome.
You can just put Louis Brogdon and the title of the article in the Google search, and the Courier article will come up. You can also go to institute.bsk.edu, and I have a fuller, more extended discussion, because if they want to know, I have a lot more to say on this subject than I could have put in an op-ed.
Yeah.
So it's over a 5,500 word essay with questions at the end. There's going to be webinars and events happening all over the place. One's going to be a national webinar. So we're going to continue the conversation, because a lot of people are reading the op-ed and they're saying, we need to do something. I want to be a part of conversations. I want to be a part of change. And so that's why I'm doing it. It's already in the governor's office in the state of Kentucky, and we're trying to contact people in the White House in Washington, D.C. To make sure that the president and members of the president's team, and hopefully our political leaders, will just take some time to maybe read it and to say, hey, wait a minute. You know, let's think about our national character. We can be a better nation in spite of our many differences. And I'm trying to spark change in this country.
Right, and that really could start one person at a time, and really it sounds like the importance here is to keep the conversation going. So I really hope that we've helped educate you at home this morning just on some of the issues plaguing America from different perspectives. We have Dr. Brogdon here, who's a scholar, and he's well-versed in religious studies as well, and we have 2 local pastors, and I want to thank each and every one of you for offering your insight and to keep this conversation going. That is the most important thing. So talk to your family, your friends, your kids about how America could be losing its soul, but how you can get involved to help it. Well, that does it for this edition of In Focus. Thank you all for joining us this morning. We'll be back here next Sunday. Have a great day.